morning. So we are entering a season where a lot of people focus on Jesus and what Jesus has done, and we focus on his birth, particularly at this time of the year. But we're going to take a couple of weeks and we're going to talk a little bit more generally about what God requires in this first week, and next week more specifically what he requires of us. And we're going to look at a couple of things that are a little bit on the, not so Christmassy side in terms of our lessons. But I hope that what we get from it can be a benefit to all of us, and we can think about these things, and we can think about how God really has been working in his world from the beginning, from creation. And his salvation plan and what he does for us is part of how he is always acting. He is always working to bring people to him. As we think about the Christmas season, as we think about what is going to go on around this particular time, the incarnation was part of that. But before we get into that, I'd like for us to take a look back in the Old Testament and think about generally what God is requiring and what he is wanting from us. And we're going to go all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 5. We're going to spend most of our time right here. And as we do that, we're not going to get very far away from this particular text. And so we're really looking at all of 2 Kings chapter 5. And there are some things that we need to be aware of at this time. This time is a time of great upheaval in the history of Israel and the history of what is going on in salvation history. It's really a time of crisis in a lot of ways. What we've got going on in this particular time, Ahab's family is on the throne. Ahab, that wicked king whose wife was Jezebel that we know, who no one names their kid Jezebel. I've heard several times people say no one names their kid Jezebel because Jezebel was just an absolute wicked woman. And she led her husband astray in so many ways, but Ahab wanted to be led astray. He was not a person who had any kind of anchor in God. He was not interested in God's ways at all. But his dynasty, as it were, lasts for several years after Ahab's death. And so we have Joram, Ahab's son, who is on the throne at this particular time. You may also see it Jehoram, and we really find that in 2 Kings chapter 3. And as it talks about the king of Israel in chapter 5, it doesn't name him specifically, but it is Joram, it is Jehoram. And I want us to see that even in this time of great upheaval, and maybe even in a greater way than we can imagine, God is working. He is working in this time of trouble. He is working in ways that are very powerful. And he's working through Elijah and he's working through Elisha. And in this, as we take a look at Scripture and we see how God has worked in various times and in various ways, we can see that when he led his people out of Israel, he did that with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And he showed his wonders to his people, and they were miraculous in so many different ways, just absolutely shattering people's perceptions of what reality was by bringing his people out of Israel in power. And there's a lot of times in the Bible where we don't see that power. We don't see all these wonders, and we don't see all these things, but we do see it in the time of this upheaval. In Elijah and Elisha. In fact, when Jesus comes on the scene sometime later, many centuries later, and he is performing these miracles, there are people who think that he is Elijah. In fact, he asks his disciples, "Who do the people say I am?" Some say you are Elijah, because of the power of Jesus and what he is doing. It is like Elijah. It is like Elisha. We see God's power working mightily in these people where there are amazing things that are happening. I think that this can be a lesson to us when we are going through difficult times, and certainly these last couple of years have been troubling for us to realize and to keep in mind that God is working even in these times when he's shaking things up and is working to bring his people together as a people so that we may be strengthened and so that we may be stronger than we've ever been. But I think that it is also important to note that God's work is often surprising, and he doesn't necessarily work in the ways that we think he's going to work. Sometimes we think that he's supposed to work in this particular way, and we've got it all figured out. This is how God works. And yet throughout history and throughout the Bible, what we see is that God works in very surprising ways. He's not one who is going to be shackled by our own perceptions of what he should or should not do. And so we have in chapter 5, Naaman, who is a commander of the army of the king of Aram. And it's interesting as we take a look at this particular situation, Aram is really not friendly with Israel at all. These are not God's people per se, even though Aram is a place where God's people were kind of formed, and we see that in Abraham, and we see that in the patriarchs. They have some affinity with these people, but they have been really not the people of God for a long, long time. And so we have this commander of the army of the king of Aram in the northern part of Syria. And he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded. And listen to this. Because through him, the Lord had given victory to Aram. And we take a look at this and we think, well, what in the world is God doing with Aram? He should be concerned with Israel. He should be concerned with Judah. But the fact is, God is concerned with all of his people. And he's using Aram. He's using that nation to make things happen for his own people even. We need to realize that too. We can take a look at all sorts of things that are shaking around this world, and we can take a look at how it seems like we are on a very shaky foundation in so many different areas. But we can be assured that God is working. And so we see him being this way, but we find that Naaman has a problem. He is a valiant soldier, but he has leprosy. And there's something that we need to understand about all of this. As we take a look at this, we can take a look at Naaman and we think, well, who is Naaman that God should be concerned with him? But we also need to realize that Naaman needs God, and God realizes that. And so we see, really, in this particular situation, he's got leprosy, and nothing in his power could save him. You know, leprosy is a disease that really up until the 1800s was basically uncurable. There were leper colonies even up into the 1800s in various places. And there are places in the world where there are people who suffer from leprosy. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not pretty. But here we have this situation where he has leprosy, and there was nothing that could save him. There was nothing in his power that could save him. But we hear that there are situations going on in this particular part of the world that is going to bring Naaman in contact with God. And we see that there are now bands from Aram in verse 2. They had gone out and had taken a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Now I find this rather amazing. We find this Israelite girl who had been taken captive by bands of Aramean soldiers or rovers or raiders, let's just call them that. And she was in Naaman's house serving Naaman's wife in a foreign country. Apparently, Naaman must have been a pretty good guy. He must have been a pretty good master. This woman must have been a pretty good master to this woman, to this young woman. But she says something. She says, "I know something that is true. I know that there is a prophet in Israel." And I don't know exactly what her particular thinking was. I don't know where her theology was. I don't know where her doctrine was. I don't know where her allegiance was. But it seems from this passage we can see that her allegiance is with God, even if the entire country was not there. She at least recognized the power of God in this man, in this prophet. And she is not afraid to share it with her master. She is not afraid to share it with her master's wife. Naaman went to his master, the king, and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me. You see, what is going on here is we know that leprosy is incurable, and you're sending him to me for me to take care of this. You're trying to pick a fight. But Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, and he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him and said, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. And I think that it is important for us to know this, that Elisha is speaking the words of God here. He is the mouthpiece of God. When that girl said there is a prophet in Israel who can take care of this, she had something specifically in mind. She knew that prophets are mouthpieces of God. They only speak the words of God. And so what Elisha is speaking are the very words of God. What is Naaman going to do about this? Well, we find that his obedience and the result was not a sure thing. And we see what Naaman's reaction is in verse 11, and it says, Naaman went away angry and said, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of his leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. And I think that it is important for us to see this as we take a look at this passage and as we take a look at our own particular situation. At times, it is not a sure thing that people are going to listen to God's word. It's not a given. Just because that is what God says to do, that is not necessarily the case. And I think about all of this, and I think about how we may go out and we may spread the gospel and we may speak the truth. But finally, it is on the person's decision. It is their will to decide, yea or nay. What will they decide to do? But we see that there are other people who are faithful, and they convince him of what needs to be done. Naaman's servants went to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? This is an easy thing. It's not complicated. Just do it. So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, and as a man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and he became clean like that of a young boy with his skin. And so we have this entire situation in which he does exactly what the man of God told him on the advice of some really good counsel. And he is cleansed. What we see here is he is not just healed, he is converted. So when we see all of what is going on the Naaman and all of his attendants went back to the man of God, and he stood before him and said, Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant. And the prophet answered, As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. If you will not, said Naaman, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. I want you to understand something. I see the power of God in my life. He has proven himself to me. There is no other God except for the God of Israel. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. Go in peace, Elisha said. And so we have someone who is more than just healed. He is converted. He has seen the power of God in his life. He will not go back. I think that there are some things that we can learn from this entire situation. And the first thing that I want us to say is God's ways are not complicated. I think we can really put these 2 points that I've got here together. He says what he means, and he means what he says. Those 2 things, as we take a look at what the servant of Naaman says to him, he says, look, if God had asked you to do something complicated, If God had asked you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? But really what he is saying is, all you need to do is you need to go down there into the Jordan River and you need to wash and you'll be cleansed. There's nothing really complicated about that. Now I want to make some things clear here, and I want us to see some things, because we're going to talk a lot about this a lot more next week. But I think that one of the problems that we have in belief is the idea that somehow God's ways are complicated, that we can't necessarily understand what this says. And so I want us to be aware of this. Now, there are some things in here that are not really all that easy. We've got to understand that there are different genres of literature. There is poetry, there is history, there is apocalyptic. There are all these different types of literature, and some of them are not really all that easy. But in the point where God says what he needs for us to do in order to live holy lives, when he says what we need to do in order to be his children, what we need to do in order to accept him as Lord, these things are clear, and he's not making it complicated. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to take that. And if there is any point in which we are trying to do doctrinal calisthenics to make the Bible say something that it doesn't, that needs to be the time when we say, I need to think this through. In my history class that I'm teaching, we are in the Reformation, and so we're talking about Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and the Anabaptists and all these people. And one of the things that I think that is interesting is, as these reformers went through and they took a look at the Bible and they said, we've got to figure out exactly what the Bible says. We need to get back to the truth. It seems like they were willing to go back to a certain point, but they weren't willing to go back all the way. They were willing to say, okay, you know what? The Bible is the authority. But how much of an authority is it? Where do we go back? Where do we draw the line? Where do we figure out what is going on? And what we find is that there were groups of people who said, you know what? We need to go back all the way to the beginning. We need to go back to exactly what God said. And we need to understand exactly what he did. And so sometimes our own background gets in our way of us really getting into the Word and figuring out what it says. I can think of so many different situations in which people have said, okay, I understand some things about what God is saying, but if I accept these things into my life, if I accept these things, then what I'm doing is I'm turning my back on my family. Or if I choose to do these things, I am going against everything that my culture is talking about. And so we get into these situations in which we say, I'm not necessarily sure that I want to go ahead and follow because it's going to make hardship for me, or by making this decision to follow God in this way, then I am rejecting what my parents taught me. And we have to realize we need to go back to this. Jesus made it clear that he did not come to bring peace, but he came to bring a sword. And when he did this, he was talking metaphorically. He's talking about the enmity that we will have with others because we make certain decisions in life. What we preach and what we teach may not always be popular, but we must believe that God means what he says and says what he means. And we must be willing to follow him when it is very clear what those things are. This is what Naaman did. I think we also need to realize that salvation is not for sale. As we take a look at this entire situation, Elisha says, I'm not going to take anything from you. There's nothing that you can give me for this. This is something that we see in the New Testament over and over again. It is a free gift of grace. We are saved by grace, so that no man can boast. Salvation is not for sale. And what we see when we go on in this particular chapter, we see that Naaman is traveling away from Elisha after Elisha said, I'm not taking anything from you. You need to go in peace. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, my master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi hurried after Naaman. When Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from his chariot to meet him. Is everything all right? He asked. Everything is all right, Gehazi answered. My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing. By all means, take 2 talents. said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then tied up the 2 tablets of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the things from the servants and put them away in the house. He sent the men away, and they left. Then he went in and stood before his master Elisha. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Elisha asked. "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money? Or to accept clothes, olive groves, vineyards, flocks, herds, or menservants or maidservants?" Doesn't go well with Gehazi. "Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and your descendants forever." Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and he was leprous, as white as snow. And so I can see Elisha saying this: is this the time to take money? Is this the time to accept clothes, olive groves, vineyards, flocks, herds, men servants, or maid servants? What Elisha is saying here is, this man has gone away as a follower of the all-living God. This is not the time to accept anything. This is the work of God. We must accept it as such. I think the other thing that we need to realize is we need to be living a life of gratitude and allegiance to what God requires. And this is exactly what Naaman does. I love this particular passage for so many reasons. But I also love it because it seems to be a precursor to what we see is truly necessary, what God requires from us in the waters of baptism. God's ways are very, very clear on this. Most of the Christian world in this part of the world is not very clear on this, and we must be clear on this. If we want to be God's child, then we must allow ourselves to be put to death in the waters of baptism. We must enter the grave with Jesus, and we must be raised to new life. It's that simple. It's that easy. God's ways are not complicated. We join in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ when we submit to the waters of baptism. And so if this is the day that you've decided that you want to make your Lord and Savior Jesus, there is no better time than today. And if you're at home watching this right now, you can give us a call and we will make preparations for this to be the day of your new birth. Whatever your need, please come as we stand and sing.